All right. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Avon Library, the Avon Senior Center, and the Avon Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to our next webinar in our Paleo series. And Terry, I'll let you introduce our guest.
Thank you so much, Tina. Yes, welcome to our second webinar for our fourth year of educational and informative events covering the people, animals, and land of the Paleo time of 12,500 years ago in this region. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, welcome. For those who have been with us along this journey, welcome back. We're happy to again be joined by our partners of the Avon Land Trust, the Farmington River Watershed Association, and the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. We're also pleased to be a third-year recipient of a grant from the Lower Farmington River and Salmon Brook Wild and Scenic Committee so that we can bring you these 5 presentations. Their funding comes from the National Park Service, which recognizes the importance of continuing education of all river matters in this country. The origin of this webinar series is the discovery in 2019 of the Brian D. Jones Paleo Indian site along the Farmington River here in Avon, Connecticut, and the first public presentation of the site in February 2020, which began a deep exploration by us into this incredible time in our world's history. To learn more, please visit the Avon Historical Society's website and drop down the page for the Brian D. Jones Paleo Indian site. Tonight, we are venturing into a new part of exploration of early times with the presentation of a science discipline called bioarchaeology, the study of human remains found in archaeological sites. This kind of work can tell us much about the health, lifestyle, diet, and mortality of people, which then can tell us what society was like and how people acted, and more importantly, how they treated each other. To explain this in detail, we welcome Alexander Garcia-Putnam, PhD, a postdoctoral diversity and innovation scholar in the anthropology department at the University of New Hampshire. He is an historical bioarchaeologist who specializes in the intersections among inequality, violence, and epidemic diseases. He promises a respectful presentation that will be more scientific than personal. He's worked all over the world on projects such as the repatriation of native tribal remains in the US, as well as in East Asia and Pacific, working with descendant communities to understand their culture and their ancestors. Dr. Garcia-Putnam has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Wyoming. Welcome, Alex. The webinar is yours.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going. All right, you guys should be able to see my introductory screen. So I think we're all good to go.
We're ready to go.
Awesome. So thank you so much for that introduction. As was mentioned, I've kind of worked all over the place and done a lot of different types of bioarchaeology and a lot of different types of archaeology. Today, because you guys are not necessarily all familiar with this type of work, I'm going to introduce you to the field and talk a little bit about kind of the state of the field, the research that I'm interested in, as well as some of the ethics around working with human skeletal remains. And I'm going to end with kind of an interesting question. When I was asked to do this webinar, one of the questions that was posed to me was, why do we have so few sets of skeletal remains from the Paleo-Indian time period here in the Americas? And so I'm going to kind of end with that and end with kind of a discussion of that situation. But as was mentioned, my name is Alex. I'm a postdoc at UNH here in New Hampshire. I'm also the co-director of the Forensic Anthropology Identification and Recovery Lab. I am not a forensic anthropologist. That's a slightly different field. I am what's called a bioarchaeologist. I work with human skeletal remains from archaeological contexts, as was mentioned. But our lab works with human skeletal remains found across the state of New Hampshire. We're the only such lab in the state. We work with state police, medical examiners, other local jurisdictions on all cases of skeletonized remains. Not every case we get is kind of medical or legal. Often remains end up being historical or archaeological, and that's my role within the lab, right? When we get those older cases. I like to say that my colleagues work on cold cases, and mine are just older and colder. So we often work with the state archaeologist and other kind of stakeholders when remains get disturbed through construction or other things like that. So pretty busy here. Always a new thing, and our lab is very student focused. So we do a lot of work with our undergraduates to kind of both in the forensic and archaeological side of things. So lots of different things, lots of different research avenues, and I'll kind of take you guys through broad strokes what bioarchaeology is. Just so we're all clear, there are images of human skeletal remains in today's presentation. All of those images were taken, are photographs taken by me. I have permission not only to take these images, but to share them. And just for kind of clarity's sake, there are no native skeletonized individuals shown in this presentation. These are all Euro-American individuals. And again, I have permissions to share these images, but I wanted to give everybody a heads up. I think it's important to kind of both acknowledge that and acknowledge that some people might be uneasy looking at human skeletal remains. So with that, we'll kind of push forward. A very little bit about me. I've worked all over the world, but I've done my schooling kind of all over the place as well. I started with a bachelor's at Skidmore College in upstate New York, where I focused broadly in archaeology. I didn't necessarily know that I wanted to work with human skeletal remains at the time. I was much more a broad focused archaeologist. I then decided that I wanted to try my hand at forensic anthropology and bioarchaeology and attended East Carolina University in my home state of North Carolina. And I graduated with a master's from ECU in 2014. I then took a little time off, did a little work doing these other things, tried to have a life outside of academia. And eventually the pull back to academia was too strong, and I enrolled and was accepted to the University of Wyoming to pursue my PhD in bioarchaeology. I was fortunate enough to have an incredible advisor and work on these incredible projects while at Wyoming. I had the misfortune of having most of my dissertation time taken up during the pandemic. Things certainly got a little interesting. And I ended up having to switch dissertation topics, all sorts of interesting things. But regardless, long story short, I was able to graduate in 2021 with my doctorate and was, by some miracle, immediately hired by the state of Washington. So we moved to the capital of Olympia, Washington, where I was part of their SHPO's office, or their State Historic Preservation Office. They call it the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. And while there, I acted as the Assistant State Physical Anthropologist. So there were two of us in the entire state that covered all non-forensic human skeletal remains finds. So anytime remains got found by someone doing construction or eroding out of a bluff, whatever it might be, if they were deemed to be non-forensic, they came to us, and we were plenty busy there. And I did a lot of that work. Much of that was working with local tribal groups in the state of Washington, as well as various other stakeholders. And then in 2023, again, the allure of academia pulled me back, and I was accepted to a postdoc, which is like a 2-year research fellowship here at the University of New Hampshire. So started in August of 23, and I've kind of hit the ground running over this first year, and I've been loving it ever since. And it's great to be back in the Northeast for certainly. So a little bit about me, but I could talk about myself all day long, and I want to move past that. So a little bit about bioarchaeology and how I do bioarchaeology. I think it's important to give you guys a straight up definition. This is how I define the field. It's the study of human skeletal remains and associated mortuary context, right? That's all the things around us when we die, how we're buried, what we're buried with, all those other big contextual things. I mean, it's all about exploring questions about the human past, right? So I'm not just interested in looking at a skeleton and understanding what this person was all about, but really understanding the past behavior, past peoples, right? Larger topics, not just kind of a one and done. Within bioarchaeology, I am a historical bioarchaeologist. So I feel like a little bit of a fraud talking about your Paleo Indian stuff today, but I still think what I have to offer is really valuable, and I'm excited to get to that part of it. But I work in the historic time period. meaning I work as that is defined here in the United States and elsewhere in the Americas is at and after European colonialism. And one of the things I really like about working in this time period is that we all know the kind of adage that history is written by the victors. Well, effectively, what that's saying is that history is really biased, or it can be really biased. And skeletal remains are far less so. So I can kind of use the human skeleton, use human skeletal remains to assess history, right? Sometimes things get left out, people get left out, stories get left out, and we can help tell those stories. On the flip side, oftentimes we're working with skeletal remains that are fragmentary or commingled, right? All jumbled together. Or, and the story that they hold is relatively incomplete. And we can use things like ethnohistoric accounts and archival records that are vetted to help us understand the individuals that we're working with. So it's kind of this two sides of the same coin, right? I'm using history, but I'm also judging history at the same time through these skeletal remains. Within bioarchaeology, my area of expertise is what's called paleopathology. Paleopathology is the study of disease in the past. So I look at both how skeletal and dental tissues are impacted by diseases, as well as who was dying, right? Was it the very young? Was it the very old? Was it more males or females? Those kinds of things. And that helps us understand mortality in the past and how people and diseases interacted in the past. We're all still kind of feeling the effects of a global pandemic. So these topics are all too prescient, I think, and all too kind of at the forefront of our minds these days. And we can see that on skeletal tissue. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at health in the past. So we can learn a lot from looking at human skeletal remains. They hold a lot of information. One of the first things that we get trained to look at is an individual's age and death, how old they were when they died. So we grow and develop at relatively known rates. And think an easy example of this is dental development, right? We all know as we're kids, we get certain teeth coming in at certain ages, right? We have our 12-year molars, those of us that have wisdom teeth, right? That came in when we were 18 to 20. And that bones also grow and fuse at a known rate. And then as we get older, bones degrade and have some more kind of age-related problems at also relatively known rates. And we can assess and estimate age from that bone growth and development and then degradation. I will say the older ages are harder to break down they're broken down into larger categories than those younger age categories. I also should draw attention to the fact that I am here talking about estimates. I don't know. They're broad categories, and the next couple I think speak to that even more, right? We can also estimate an individual's biological sex. So that is looking at skeletal remains of adults only, right? We only can estimate sex on adults because we're looking at these bony changes that happen as a result of puberty. Things like changes associated with childbirth, obviously, are only come about at puberty. And also, we can look at what's called sexual dimorphism. That is, in most mammal species, males are typically larger and more robust than females. But these are estimates, right? We're looking at, skeletal features to estimate someone's sex. I should also say here that gender, this is not the cultural concept of gender. Gender is much more complicated, and we must rely on a bunch of other contextual information, but it's often inaccessible to us. Certainly from the skeleton alone, it is inaccessible. We also traditionally have been tasked with and been asked to estimate ancestry or geographic affinity. It used to be called race. We have moved away from that term in anthropology because of the kind of larger connotations that term holds. So the way I like to think of this is that humans vary a lot, right? If we lined all of us up in one big room, you could see just based on the height of everybody, that humans vary a tremendous amount, right? My wife is 5'2" and I'm 6'2". So, but variation exists on a continuum. We can, with some accuracy, assess people's ancestral groups, that is kind of evolutionarily long-term where they were from, if they are on extremes of that continuum. It gets really complicated when we're assessing folks that are more similar to one another, right? So ancestry estimation looks at various measurements or traits on the skull and on other parts of the body, and attempts to say this suite of traits or this suite of measurements is typically corresponds to a population or a group that lives here, right? It's not perfect and it's really complicated. We live in a globalized, interconnected world, and things are getting more and more complicated. So note that I never in any of that talk of ancestry or variation did I mention anything about skin color, right? And that is because so the way we think of it in anthropology is that race is not a biological concept, it is a cultural construct, but that construct can and does have very real biological consequences. Think about racial disparities in health, you know, and things like average age at death. Those certainly are real biological consequences of this social construct that is race. So we can do estimations of age at death, biological sex. If the remains are complete enough and if things are kind of work out, we can attempt to assess things like ancestry. We can also, my area of expertise, look at signs of disease, physiological stress, and trauma that these individuals had during life. So I like this slide, and it starts off kind of weird, and I'll explain it here in a minute. So one individual is interesting, right? We can learn about their age, their sex, maybe their gender, maybe their ancestry. We can learn a little bit about their health profile and maybe something about their identity, right? If they were local, if they were non-local, right? Were they migrants to this place? We, you know, with things like DNA and isotopes, we can continue to probe this idea of an individual's identity in the past. And that's neat, right? That's quite interesting. But what's more interesting is to use skeletal samples to explore past populations. So instead of one person, if we have a skeletal sample, we might be able to say, what's the average age at death? And what does that say about the health of this population? Were there more males than females? And what does that demographics makeup say about this population, say about life in the past in this culture? Were there migrants, or were there locals? You know, are some people more related to each other than others, right? And is that pattern, say, in a cemetery? Who was sick, right? Which of a group was sick? Was it the old? Was it the young? Are there differences in burial goods or other markers of identity? Maybe we can get at social hierarchy, right? Was there social stratification in this group? So lots of different information gleaned from a single skeleton, and so much more from a skeletal sample. We can really use a sample to understand a past population. Now, I will say one of the big complications is that we are attempting to explore past living populations through a sample of exclusively dead individuals. And that presents some very real challenges. Apologies, my cat is trying to get up on my lap right now. So you derailed me, buddy. So within bioarchaeology, there are a number of specialties. I've already mentioned a few of them, right? My area of expertise is what's called paleopathology, the study of ancient disease and trauma. Some individuals also look at occupation or activity markers. So certain repeated activities can leave signs on the skeleton. Patterns of arthritis or other musculoskeletal markers, along with good contextual evidence, can suggest certain activities, but you have to have that context. Folks have looked at things like horseback riding, archery, weaving, forced labor, agriculture. And without good contextual information, sometimes those signs may be very jumbled. So you can't just build them off the skeleton. You have to build them with other archaeological evidence or other historical evidence. Right, most of those patterns are relatively non-specific, but through that context and those patterns, you might be able to say something about a past activity. Other people are very interested in what's called biological distance analysis or biodistance analysis. And that uses cranial and dental traits to assess group relatedness. So it's very interesting to look at maybe familial or kin groups in a cemetery, assess migrants versus not versus locals within a burial population. Effectively, it's what I was talking about earlier. This suite of traits is more common in this group. Maybe they're more related to one another. Many people are getting into isotopic analysis. I could give an entire talk on isotopic analysis. That's way beyond the scope of today, trying to give you guys big broad strokes. But effectively, you uptake isotopes of various elements from the environment, from the food and water that you drink, and from the environment you live in, right? So signatures of oxygen isotopes and strontium isotopes can be tied back to the locations that you live. And you can assess, again, people's migration through life that way. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes can help us understand diet in the past. So it's actually directly from those foods that we eat. A really big up and coming field is, and one that's really, really exciting, is ancient DNA. So our skeletons are not devoid of DNA. Actually, our DNA is still there in many cases, given the correct preservation circumstances. But there's a lot of potential, not only for understanding the human genome in the past, but also ancient viral DNA that may still be kind of surviving in our bodies. So not only can you understand the person, but also some of those microorganisms that might be living inside that person. So a huge wealth of information from ancient DNA, and every year it gets more and more exciting. And so it's like, that's one of those fields that's just constantly updating. It's very, very exciting. This is kind of my plug and my push for us to understand bioarchaeology a little bit more. I am what's called an applied bioarchaeologist, which means that I work with the public good in mind at all times. It also means that I don't necessarily go out and do large research-focused excavations. My take is, if a cemetery or a burial area is not going to be disturbed, why disturb it, right? I don't want to be part of that destruction. Archaeology is inherently destructive, and human remains deserve to be left alone when they can be. Now, often, so what that means is I'm often called out to construction sites or when people find unmarked burials. And in that case, I'm certainly happy to help them remove them scientifically and precisely so that we can rebury that individual completely somewhere else. That's always been my focus within bioarchaeology. And I think it's really important to kind of tell that to you guys. That is where the field is really moving right now. We kind of joke in our lab, if we could always have an empty lab, we would, right? We don't want remains to come to us. That means something has happened to those individuals. So I try to work as quickly as possible to get remains back to communities of interest or descendant communities or local cemeteries so that they can be, whatever final respectful disposition that group wants. Forensic anthropology, which is these same skill sets, but applied to kind of a medical or legal context, that's very applied, right? You're locating remains, identifying them, potentially solving crimes. You're working within that medical and legal process. I view my bioarchaeology as very similar to that, right? I am trying to get these individuals from the past back in the ground, back in some respectful final disposition that their whatever community of interest or descent community is most interested in having. So there are a number of organizations that do this type of work. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about NAGPRA here in a minute, but that is, they're chiefly concerned, that federal act is chiefly concerned with getting native remains back out of institutions and into the hands of tribes. There's also the work done by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. That's kind of somewhere between forensics and bioarchaeology. They're going out and trying to recover past war dead from World War II forward. And then there's state agencies like the one I worked for, the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, that are trying to do this work at the state level. And then there are labs like ours that are trying to do it when the state may not necessarily have the resources to help out, but we as a lab can kind of offer our services. We are a state institution, and part of that is service to the state, and that we see this work as a state service. So, you know, this kind of applied bioarchaeology involves helping get remains repatriated, helping do cemetery relocations. You know, this can happen from flooding, from natural disasters, where cemeteries get eroded out and they need to be relocated because of construction, those kinds of things. And then also recovery as needed is really how I like to think of it. I apologize in advance for these next two slides. There's just not any great imagery to show with these. I wanted to take you guys through the quickest of histories of the field of bioarchaeology. And I will do my darndest to keep it exciting, but I will also do my darndest to move through it relatively quickly. So the field of bioarchaeology was always kind of an appendix. We were always the specialists that were brought in. And then in 1977, someone who was doing that kind of work, her name is Jane Bykestra. She's still practicing bioarchaeologist. She wrote an article and kind of unified and named the field. And a lot of what she said and her contemporary said was bioarchaeology needs to answer questions about the past through the scientific method, right? She was very interested in making bioarchaeology scientific, and also was very interested in making it so that we were asking our own questions, right? We were our own scientific question, asking our own scientific questions. As I said, we were often these kind of experts that were brought in. So oftentimes that meant brought into the lab after the field work. So some archaeologists would excavate remains, and then they would say, hey, I got you some bones in the lab. Now all that context is gone. And the change with kind of Bykestra naming and unifying the field was that we were kind of able to now run our own projects, ask our own questions, and do our own excavations, right? And that was really, really important. That kind of birthed the field, if you will. And it also cemented the fact that bioarchaeology is inherently biocultural. If you guys leave with anything today, I want you to remember that term. And humans are biocultural, right? Human life, human behavior is shaped not just by our biology and not just by the fact that we're cultural beings, but by their interplay together, right? We are both a product of our culture and our biology and how those intermix. Early bioarchaeology was really interested in human environment interaction and asking kind of big questions about the human past. So and then the field kind of took off and became more and more popular. And in 1999, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed. And this led to a major shift in bioarchaeology. So that law effectively put in place the requirement to repatriate remains to Native groups. Especially, and this was at first, and very much still is, only federally recognized tribes, and it was only in projects that were from federal or tribal lands where federal dollars were at play. Things have evolved with the law since 1990. There was actually an update to it just last year. I will be the first to tell you, so NAGPRA is incredibly complicated, but it gave a really needed protection to not only native skeletal remains, but also burial goods and other goods of cultural patrimony. So a really needed change to the law, but it certainly kind of was a large upheaval in the field of bioarchaeology. There's a train going by. I apologize if it becomes really loud. As I said, this was a major moment and a very needed one many people were doing a lot of excavation of native remains with very little tribal consultation. And one of the reactions to NAGPRA was maybe not so pretty, but it was to move a lot of bioarchaeology internationally, where NAGPRA didn't have jurisdiction, and also where local populations may be fine with bioarchaeological fieldwork, right? So it was not all doom and gloom, and we weren't being absolutely atrocious, right? But there was this shift toward away from working in the United States and working with on native remains in the United States, and a shift toward more international fieldwork. And NAGPRA still is is still at play today, and it is stronger than ever. As I said, major updates just came out, so really excited to see kind of how this changes, and excited to see the continued protection of native remains and native artifacts. So not so long after NAGPRA was put in place in the 90s, was kind of the first major controversy within bioarchaeology that post-NAGPRA. And that was the discovery of remains in Kennewick, Washington, often referred to as the Ancient One or Kennewick Man. That happened in 1996. The remains were discovered, and they were initially dated to be older than about 9,000 years before present. So incredibly old. These are still some of the oldest skeletal remains from the Americas, certainly from North America. And they are incredibly important scientifically, and incredibly important to native groups that tie their ancestry back, to the early periods in the United States. So incredibly important from a number of different angles. And unfortunately, because this was a big important find, it ended up kind of turning into kind of a political nightmare. So not only did this eventually go to court, right, scientists won a lawsuit in 2002 to study the remains, but they actually had to take a bunch of these native groups to court to get access to these remains. But there was a lot made of some early observations by one of the anthropologists that said that the remains didn't look like a native individual to them, right? The ancestry that they calculated or estimated, as I would say, came back as not necessarily that close to other native individuals that they had worked on. And hindsight being 2020, that's absolutely crazy now. But there were plenty of people in the scientific community that supported this notion that these may not necessarily be native remains. Again, hindsight being 2020, they were wrong. These are 9,000-year-old remains. These are definitively the ancestors of modern native groups living here today. Not only does the bioarchaeological assessment of ancestry turn up what ends up being a relatively inconclusive set of remains, but ancient DNA analysis was completed, and it was conclusively shown that the remains are closer to modern native populations than any other group. So, but again, this timeline was 20 years in the making, right? From the discovery of the remains, the lawsuits, the fight. The book came out in 2014, DNA in 2015, and then finally in 2016, after more legal battling and more kind of politicking, the tribes got a coalition of tribes from the state of Washington got the remains back, and they are now back in Washington under tribal control, and I believe buried in an undisclosed location, but I'm actually not quite sure what has happened to them. But regardless, a very long, very fraught story, and it was a real challenge within the field. How do we deal with both doing our research and respecting, descendant communities, and it was not handled perfectly. Most people would tell you that, and we have, as a field, really strove to, continue to strive to do better and better and better. From the 2000s forward, I would say we're now in kind of a period of self-reflection. We've begun to think about the skeletal collections that we all train on, right? There are these massive skeletal collections housed at different museums and institutions that we get trained on. And most of those are comprised of the bodies of unclaimed paupers, of bodies who robbed from graves, and of bodies of other kind of marginalized groups within this country. And many of these individuals were turned into anatomical specimens, right? Turned from a person into a thing without their consent. And that's a pretty ugly history that we as bioarchaeologists are really beginning to grapple with and beginning to really work toward a better solution. There's also a huge push, like me, for a more applied version of bioarchaeology, right? Bioarchaeology as needed. There's also more and more historical bioarchaeology going on. And one of the things that I am really proud of in my work, and I think is really important, is, right, oftentimes marginalized groups in our history were not buried in known locations, right? Many unmarked burial grounds, or burial grounds that were paved over or constructed over. And those individuals and their histories and their stories can get lost, purposefully or not. And one of the coolest things about the work that I've tried to do is I can do bioarchaeology, right? I can go out and do these research projects because I'm also trying to understand their histories and bring those stories back to light, and highlight some of those things that may have been erased or obscured in historical records, right? We can then work with local communities, local descendant groups to get those individuals reburied in a proper grave. So it's research with a good outcome, and an outcome that these descendant communities want in many cases. And I talk about communities of interest and descendant communities ad nauseum because they should be the ones dictating the work that we do. And that's really where we are as a field in bioarchaeology. But now that I've given you guys this extremely long primer, I do want to get to this question. So I want to take us way back in time now. To the question I was asked at the very outset of this, when I agreed to do this webinar, which was, why are there so few examples of human remains from the Paleo-Indian period within the United States and within the Americas more broadly? And so the first thing I had to ask myself is, all right, well, how many are there? So I went searching, and a publication from 2020 from Haas and colleagues writes that there are 429 individuals from 107 sites that date from the Paleo-Indian time period across the Americas. So if you look at the land area of the Americas, North and South America, you get a land area of 16,428,000 square miles. So just a little bit of land. And if you look at that 429 individuals, that puts you at one burial every 38,000 square miles. And just to give you guys a reference, Maine is just around 30,000 square miles. So that's one burial every Maine. Actually, one burial, less than one burial every Maine. So there are very few of them, is the answer. So you are correct in asking that question. There are just not that many, right? And the simple answer as to why is because there are typically less older things, right? There's more chances of destruction, damage, all these things on older sets of remains. So what we call taphonomy is the study of all the conditions after death, right? So it's all the things that can happen to a body after death. This includes things like moisture and aridity, the water table, right? You can imagine if the water table is rising and falling. Things like animal scavengers, tree roots, other biotic disturbances, but also human activities. Not just things like construction, but also thinking about people in the past. People would bury the dead and sometimes dig them back up, or they would not bury the dead and then bury their bones in bundles. So not only are there various cultural practices with skeletal remains, there are also things like construction and a million other human activities that can impact the preservation of remains. So all of that falls under this umbrella of taphonomy. So all the things that can happen. Preservation is best when conditions are static, right? Whether it's all arid all the time, all humid all the time, static is best. And the more kind of microorganisms and that kind of thing there are, also not great for preservation, right? These are organic tissues, so things like to munch on them. So that's the first reason we have so few of them, right? We have a longer time period for all of these things to act on those sets of skeletal remains. So it's a big preservation issue. The second and also really critical factor is that population densities were very low during the Paleo-Indian time period. So not only do you have few people, but you have few people whose remains are going to be subjected to all of these things over thousands of years. So 429 burials sounds like a really small number, but it's actually kind of an amazingly large number also when you think of all these factors. I should also stress things we talked about here a little bit earlier. Right, bioarchaeologists, less bioarchaeologists are working in North America, especially in pre-contact era context. There are very few folks that are, because of this kind of small numbers, I've never met someone who defines themselves as a Paleo-Indian bioarchaeologist. That effectively does not exist here in this country, or even other places in the Americas. It's just not a field that people do because the numbers are small and people aren't working in those areas. There's also, again, ethical considerations, right? Do descendant communities want this type of research? So I hope that kind of answers your big, broad question of kind of why we have so few of these burials. You know, when they do come up, they are amazing, right? Anything that old, whether it's a projectile point or a set of skeletal remains, right? We're touching a piece of, you know, this country's distant past, and that's really exciting. And it should be able to be understood, but also respected, and you know, and we should work with Native groups as much as we can to make sure that we're all coming at things together. You know, I think bringing Native groups to the table, bringing you know, voices of descendant communities to the table is absolutely critical in whatever type of archaeology we're doing, but particularly bioarchaeology. So I want to end quickly with this quote by Deborah Martin. She's one of the kind of foremost bioarchaeologists today. She's at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. In her 2013 book, she said, "A broad, cross-cultural, historically situated study of human behavior is an important scholarly activity that contributes to explaining the complex human behaviors that underlie the pressing and persistent problems today." Right? We can look at the past and it can help us make a better future and present. Bioarchaeology may be the only disciplinary effort that can provide information on the origins and evolution of violence, disease, inequality, diet, just to name a few. So we are, you know, many of my friends are archaeologists, and they work with ceramics or projectile points or architecture or metal goods. And those are all proxies. Those artifacts are all proxies for past human behavior. As a bioarchaeologist, I'm working with the physical remains of a past life. And so it carries with it a different set of ethics, a different set of responsibility, and a different set of amazing research potential as well. So with that, I would love to open it up for questions. And talk to you guys. I thank you so much for hearing me yammer on. I know this is maybe not what everyone wants to do at 7:45 in their evening on a Thursday, but certainly what I enjoy doing. So thank you.
Thank you. We do have a dedicated history audience, so they absolutely do want to know about this topic. You don't have to worry at all. If anyone has questions, please type them in the chat or the Q&A. I think everyone was following all of the arc of what you were saying, because this is new information to us. And so let's see.
Awesome. Would you like me to go ahead and stop my share?
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, okay, Gina, while you're looking, I wanted to, a whole lot of things are swirling in my head about this because I'm involved with the Connecticut Freedom Trail, like there are freedom trails for all over the country that, of course, they memorialize a lot of the Black culture in our society. And, you know, what's come to light, and even on 60 Minutes not too long ago, there was a whole piece on how so many Black cemeteries have been covered over You know, in past decades, there has just been, you know, no care for these kind of cemeteries. And so they've been covered over, become parking lots, they've become shopping centers. And so when descendants are looking for their ancestors and they end up in the middle of a parking lot, it's, you know, very depressing in this whole thing. But
Absolutely.
things happen. So I'm not surprised to hear what you say about that, because of course, these are another way that these things can be just that the human remains can disappear and be gone forever. You know, and that's a shame that is happening. But you said something, I'm trying to remember now all the things I wanted to ask you, but anyway, Tina, go ahead.
So the first question from our guest is, are there Native Americans working in your field?
So there are many Native scholars that work in archaeology. The pool of Native bioarchaeologists is very small. Unfortunately, I actually can't name any. So but I do know that there are a couple graduate students that I've heard of that are kind of up and coming, which, as far as I'm concerned, that's the most exciting thing, right? I want the younger generation to be kind of taking this stuff over. While I worked in the state of Washington, we worked with many tribal historic preservation officers. Effectively, many of them are trained as archaeologists, and they're not necessarily bioarchaeologists, but given that they come out on all these excavations and work with us, and we help them with recoveries, many of them are very versed in this kind of work. But in terms of academia, it's a very small pool.
The next question is, this is a big philosophical one, which is how our audience is. How do you see this research influencing our modern day conversations on race and relationships with each other?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I love about what we do is that you know, when I'm talking to my students and we're looking at it, we're working on a set of skeletonized remains, we all look the same. And it's kind of awesome. You know, when you strip us down to our bones, you know, we can tell a lot about a person, but at the same time, you know, all those divisions disappear. And at the same time, the more nuanced and the more we look, we can still see those pieces of inequality, those pieces of marginalization etched on the remains of those individuals. So, you know, the way we treat people in life does follow them in death also. So it's this double-edged sword. And I have to give a shout out to my students. I work with only undergraduates. We don't have graduate students in our department. And they are the most caring, thoughtful students. And they are so concerned. They think of the people we work with as people, and we all should be doing that in this field. And I think the level of kind of the humanizing value of that can't be understated.
Okay, that gave me the good goosebumps. I like that. That was a great answer.
So you said there's about 400 Paleo Indian skeletons that
my understanding, and that's from the Americas in general. So many of those, I believe, are older and from, I would put my money on the fact that many of those are from South America.
Okay, well that goes along with the ancient DNA talk we had last year. Tina's put that into the chat for the link for that. Because there are a couple of postdocs, or maybe they're grad students at UConn, who have really specialized in ancient DNA in South America. And their talk was mostly about, I think, Argentina and Venezuela, and making some connections to how people came here, might have boated down instead of walking across the Bering, the Bering Strait to come down. I mean, there's various different things. All of this ancient DNA work that's being done, that's just so fascinating. So that's really great.
I will say that I thankfully do not have a horse in the race of the colonization of the New World. That is a hot button topic, and one that I will happily bow out of.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
The next audience question is, where can we go, websites or resources, if we want to learn more on this field? So
I'm embarrassed to say that my lab does not have a website yet. We're actually building it this summer. But in terms of learning more about this field, we as a field are relatively horrible at getting out here and doing things like this. And so there are podcasts, there are groups that kind of talk about these things, but I try to make an effort to do public engagement and to do kind of historical society talks, given especially given the fact that I work in the historic time period. But I will ponder some resources and send them your guys' way.
Oh, great. Great. We'll send them out to everybody. That'd be fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That'd be very helpful. That's good.
And that rounds out what we have in the chat and Q&A. So we can just do any concluding thoughts.
Fabulous. Well, I really, really appreciate this, Alex. This was fabulous because I think what we're doing in this series this year is kind of bringing a lot of things together. We've been spending an awful lot of time diving into a lot of different specific scientific areas of the Paleo period, but I think this year we're really spending a lot on it more general and also the new things that are happening. And this is a new science. Even though it's kind of been around in one way or the other for probably a pretty long time, especially through medical schools, they've been looking at skeletons forever and studying. I mean, even Michelangelo and all that kind of thing. I mean, that goes back a long way. But now that it's kind of more defined and it's more used for the research for this kind of your work that you're doing with what the society was like, that's really, a really fascinating field. And of course, it's going to grow. So we appreciate your sharing it with us. Thank you very much. And glad you're a cat person like Tina and I are. I see Patches is sitting right over her shoulder there. She has a Patches. I have a Patches as well, just by accident. And
yes, we need your cat's name, Alex, before we log off, because we can't leave our viewers without it.
I have Joey and Patches. I have a brother and cat. What's his?
Gus and Ollie are running around somewhere.
Good.
Yeah. Ollie is new. He's a kitten and he is an absolute monster. I'm actually surprised he didn't bull my computer over mid-talk. So
they have a tendency to do that. Well, congratulations on all the work that you're doing. Good luck with building the website. Send us some links that we can get out to
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, and thank you guys so much. And thank the audience. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. And, the more people understand what we do, the kind of better it is as far as I'm concerned. So
great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.